Now, one of the most significant contributors to this recession was a financial crisis as dire as any we've known in generations, at least since the 30s, that brought down many of the world's largest financial firms and nearly dragged our economy into a second Great Depression.
Recently, economists have drawn parallels between the Great Depression and the current credit crisis. Though the initial stages of the Great Depression and today's crisis are similar, today's crisis pales in severity.
The unemployment rate of the current credit crisis has only just reached about 10%, while at its worst, unemployment in the 1930s reached nearly 25%. Currently, the deflationary pressure is a third of what it was in the 30s, and as of 2008, the GDP declined by 2%, whereas the GDP fell by over 25% by 1933 from its peak in 1929. In the first 10 months of 1930, there were 744 bank failures, whereas there were only 140 bank failures in 2009. Additionally, government intervention in the Great Depression was hindered by legislation that no longer exists today.
There are two theories economists use to explain both crises. Demand-driven, a Keynesian theory, prescribes that the government should increase spending and cut taxes when the unemployment rate rises. This theory blames recessions on economic bubbles of underconsumption and overproduction, as well as a reduction of investment spending.
Monetarists, on the other hand, maintain that recessions are caused by poor policies by major monetary authorities.
In the case of the Great Depression, the recession of 1929 was enhanced by policy mistakes of the Federal Reserve, such as shrinking the money supply and debt deflation. This is the view of the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. The Florida land boom of the early 1920s saw land prices soar under the expectation of a constant consumer market. However, as railroad embargoes continued to cause living prices to escalate, the bubble burst. This parallels the subprime loan housing market bubble, which boomed between 1997 and 2006 before abruptly bursting in 2007. Like the realtors of 1920s Florida, the mortgage corporations assumed that the housing market would increase indefinitely. They reaped the cash flow of subprime loans issued to creditors with inadequate income or assets, but failed to acknowledge any long-term risks. In 2007, the risks caught up with them when the housing bubble burst and the customer pool disappeared.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average's steep drop in September of 2008 culminated in the bankruptcy and disappearance of the 5 main investment houses of Wall Street. This sudden turning point spurred the earliest government large-scale intervention regarding the financial downturn. The shock of the downturn mirrors the national panic that ensued the stock market crash of October 29, 1929. With a surge of consumer confidence and industrial expansion in the early 1920s, a production boom saturated the market and created an economy with much supply but very little demand, resembling today's overproduction. In both eras, Americans increasingly relied on credit and margin purchases while decreasing their savings. Also, a greater share of the American public began to risk their own money in the stock market. The stock market was no longer a rich man's game.
Due to a series of restrictive legislation, the Hoover administration was unable to sufficiently respond to the crisis. The gold standard limited the amount of credit the Federal Reserve could issue to the amount of gold it had in its vaults.
When people panicked in response to the crash, they tried to redeem their demand notes, and the Fed's gold supply was further depleted, also reducing issuable credit. Regulations like the gold standard, combined with President Hoover's fear that federal intervention would compromise the individuality and work ethic of the people, prevented the Hoover administration from initially intervening in the economy. Hoover's main contribution to fighting the Depression was the Hoover Dam, a massive public works project designed to reassure faith in the government. Late and ineffective, however, Hoover's policies were unable to stop the recession from degenerating into a full-blown depression.
The inauguration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 heralded a new approach to the economic crisis. One of his first measures was to remove the country from the gold standard, injecting more money into the economy and allowing it to be backed solely by consumer faith, as it remains today. Roosevelt's first 100 days concentrated on 3 tenets: relief, recovery, and reform. He created several agencies, such as the WPA, CCC, and AAA, that stimulated the economy through job creation, agrarian and urban support, and corporate regulations. Following the sudden drop of the Dow Jones and the collapse of the Wall Street investment houses in September of 2008, the government enacted several short-term emergency responses. These include the expansion of the M2 money supply, the creation of TARP, the Troubled Asset and Relief Program, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009.
The most recent initiative, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, detailed the terms of the 2009 stimulus package. Nominally worth $787 billion, the package intends to create jobs and promote investment in consumer spending. These intense and immediate responses contrasted the initial years of the Great Depression.
This is the central lesson not only of this crisis, but of our history. It's what I said when I spoke here 2 years ago. Because ultimately, there is no dividing line between Main Street and Wall Street. We will rise or we will fall together as one nation.